Morning of August 1st, 2022, approaching 10 a.m. We're at the corner of what I would call Prospect Hill Road, but what the sign says is Prospect Street and Route 276. We're facing in a southwesterly direction. The Northeastern Clinton Central School is right there. Bob Venn Park is that way. I think we can see the flag flying over there. Village of Champlain, a mile or so in that direction to the west, and to the east, a couple miles down the road, is Rouse's Point. But we're interested in what was happening in this direction. We're, I would guess, approximately 2.5 miles from the Canadian border. And we've come here to meet historian David Patrick, who's going to make this presentation. Not quite sure what direction he wants to go. I know it won't be north across the border, but maybe some of his references might be north across the border. David, I'm going to introduce you in a second, but the first thing that crosses my mind, this is the home of Louis and Rita Bedard, and I notice there's a historic marker on the side of that building. Usually they're on a post somewhere, and people can stop and look at them. If this building ever changes hands, what's going to happen to that historic marker?
Well, we're going to have to probably put the marker up on one of those wayside panel aluminum stands, hopefully someplace still on the property. Hopefully, if the property does change hands, the new owner will allow us to keep the two panels on the house.
So they belong to the Bedards, theoretically?
No, they technically belong to either the town of Champlain. They were obtained by grants from the Lake Champlain Basin program, so they don't actually go with the house. But Mr. Bedard was very kind to allow us to keep it put it on the house. At the time, he didn't want it on the lawn because of mowing the lawn.
I understand.
So
I get my weed trimmer out all the time.
Exactly.
To go around those things.
So it was a lot easier to put it on the house. And actually, people do stop by. Well, you know, especially a lot of Canadians, when they see the signs or they hear about the Dewey's Tavern, they stop and take a look at what the sign says. The signs were put up on 2 different years, and they cover different subjects.
Okay.
So we did 2 signs. One was on the history of Dewey's Tavern, another on the property in the Glenwood Cemetery, which is just south of here.
As you know, when historian Alan Everest put out a book for the bicentennial of Clinton County, he called this house one of the most historic homes still standing in Clinton County. And certainly this is many years later, so I think it was 88. So we're now 34 years later, so it's still standing and it's still very historic.
I mean, if you think about the history of this particular house, which was built 1800, and we'll get into the history a little bit in a few minutes, but you had the American and British soldiers camped around this house here. General Wade Hampton stayed in the house for at least a day while his army marched up to Canada, where he was defeated. And you had General Prevost was here, British general, and you had 2 prisoner of war treaties were signed in this house, probably in this kitchen, 2 of the 4 that were signed toward the end of the war. So you had some serious major generals and officers from both sides of the army in this house, and countless travelers traveling from Albany to Montreal. This used to be the main road to Canada, right. This particular road here.
Yes.
And imagine the entire British Army, 14,000 soldiers, marching down Route 276. They actually divided in half at Dewey's. One half went to where Alan Racine's house is on Prospect Street, and the other half continued down to Mason's Corners. And then they all met up around Honey Moore's Corners, and on their way to Plattsburgh. That was August 1814.
Wow, early September.
What's that?
Early September.
Yeah,
They came,
they entered Champlain around August 27th, 1814, and then within a few days, I think it was about the 3rd of September, they started marching to Plattsburgh, and then they camped in Chazy, etc. And by the 10th or 11th, they were in Plattsburgh.
Right. Yeah, I think Pliny Moore's journal. You let me quote it when I put out my Champlain 2000 book. He said August 28th, the first Indian scouts were here. Then shortly after that.
So what happened was
across.
General Izard was camped right above St. Mary's Church in the village of Champlain. He didn't want to leave because he knew that the British Army was about to come down, but he was under orders to. He delayed it until the last second. He left. Literally the next day, the British Indian Force came down, checked things out, and then the day after, it was probably around the August 28th or 29th, the British Army started coming down, and they literally camped in all these fields here. The Deweys owned 500 acres of land at all four corners here of what we call Dewey's Corners. So 500 acres, and a lot of that land was cleared. So imagine the troops camped literally where you're filming right across here, and where the school was.
Northeastern Clinton School is there.
Yeah, and across the street here, and where the cemetery was.
Well, yeah, you need a lot of camping room to fit that many troops.
Yeah, I mean, imagine 14,000 soldiers, 10 to 14,000, literally camped around here.
That's their soldiers now. That doesn't include all the followers.
Yes, and there was cooks, wives, children, what they call camp followers, people, and they even hired Canadians to help haul the all the wagons and stuff like that. So it certainly was more than that.
Yeah, and there were Canadian voltigeurs who were part of their entourage too, the Canadian forces.
Yeah.
I did a recent, when the border reopened here, I did a little tour with Steve Bronson, the Champlain Port Director, which includes all the, from Trout River to Rouse's Point. And I said, there must have been one heck of a line at the border when those troops were coming through. You figure 14,000 have to check all their IDs and everything.
Yeah, and what I read was it took several days for the army to literally pass. They walked 4 abreast, and when half the army passed over the bridge on Oak Street in Champlain, it took 12 hours for half the British Army to march over the bridge. I mean, literally through the downtown Champlain, onto Main Street, and then technically down to what was called the State Road, which was Route 9.
Yeah, and of course they weren't checking their IDs when they came across.
I should say this road here that you're looking at, Route 276, was opened around 1807 and was called the Great Northern Turnpike. And Pliny Moore was one of the commissioners, and their plan was to build a highway from Montreal to Albany. And they actually raised money, and there was tolls, etc. And they laid out Prospect Street, 1807, and this connected up to the King's Highway, which is literally the same road on the north of the border, and that was opened up in 1807, and over time that turned into the State Road, and then turned into Route 9, and it literally went down to Albany through the Adirondacks.
Oh yeah, and it goes all the way down to Broadway and beyond.
Yeah, but this part here, the Great Northern Turnpike, was the name of this particular road right here that we're looking at.
Okay. Now you got me here for a particular purpose, and I don't want to sidetrack you too much.
Yeah, so we're just going to talk a little bit about the history of the house and the grounds and the property all around here, just to record it, and then we'll look at the house, and we'll look at the shed, which is actually the original log cabin built by Elias Dewey around 1797 or 1798. So anyway, the Deweys came from Weatherford, Connecticut. They were a New England family by starting around 1800, late 1790s, 1810, etc. A lot of families came from Massachusetts, Connecticut, the Albany area, and settled in Champlain. And all this land was opening up, and especially the Canadian Nova Scotia refugee tract, where all this land was being sold. We were actually on the border of what's called the Morrisfield Grant, which is the Smith and Grace patent, same name. And the grant is actually this road here, where Route 276 comes down from Canada, and it goes down to around St. Joseph's Church, and then it makes a right. And what it is was Pliny Moore in 1785 received 11,600 acres of land, and it was a square piece of land. It was about 4.25 miles square. He divided it into 119 lots, and this is actually the edge of the lot, this road here. Where we're standing in between here and Rouse's Point was a Canadian and Nova Scotia refugee tract, and that was another grant given to the Canadian soldiers who fought in the Revolution, and a lot of them sold their land over the years to settlers from New England states, and a lot of them went back to Canada. But so Elias Dewey bought 500 acres of land. His father-in-law, named Hamilton, I think John Hamilton, lived just up the road, and Elias Dewey married a Lovisa Hamilton, and they had 13 children. So when Elias came to Champlain, he actually had to cut the road, what we call Prospect Street, between this house here and Rouse's Point. So there was barely a road, and he cut it, and then he built the log cabin, which we'll look at in a few minutes. And he lived there for 3 years, 2 or 3 years, depending on when he came, and had 4 children in the cabin. Because this property was literally on the road to Canada, he actually decided to build this main house in 1800. And he got the money because he built a potash building, which was right behind the house. And all the settlers and himself, they burned wood, which became the cinders, and then you leach it, you evaporate it, and you create potash. And that potash was basically cash. You were printing cash almost. You could take that potash, take it to Montreal, and it was shipped to England. And he had a huge business, and everyone was coming with their wood to burn at his house. So he became very wealthy just selling potash. And that's when he built his house in 1800, which was actually a nice frame house. And so he built the house there, and then a few years later, because it was on the road to Canada and he had so many people traveling by, he built the back addition, which you're looking at right now. And so the house had 15 rooms, and everyone that came by this house, they stayed at the Tavern.
It's kind of a B&B, bed and breakfast.
Well, it was,
of its
because if you think about it, there weren't too many houses between here and Plattsburgh, or
right.
between here and Montreal.
Right.
And
if you're on a stage and you want to spend
you were
the night.
Yeah, you were exhausted traveling, by horse or walking. The temperatures probably weren't very nice. Imagine the weather.
Yeah.
And you needed a place to stay, and so they had lots of people just come here and stay here.
Now you mentioned potash. What was that used for once they got to England?
Potash was used in textiles, glassworks, a lot of manufacturing, and because all this land was being cleared here and in Canada, Montreal was the place to take it, and from Montreal it was shipped to England and used in the manufacturing process. So people found other ways to make potash, decades or 100 years later.
Right.
But in the late 1700s to mid 1800s, it was an ample supply of wood that was being cut down here in the forests to make fields, and all that excess wood, the wood that you wouldn't burn during the winter, was sold as potash.
So it really helped enable the development of this area through here, through up in Lower Canada, because they could make some money off of it.
Yeah, and there was people who didn't have horses or oxen, so they would actually bring their potash that they had collected. I mean, sometimes it was just a bag full, and take it here, and then the Deweys would transport it by oxen to Montreal. They would go there. They would then buy, things that you couldn't buy in Champlain, because Montreal was a fairly large city, and then they take it back here. So there was always a lot of trade, purchasing between Champlain and Montreal.
Yeah. Of course, that trade was on hold during the War of 1812 when we were being attacked. Okay, so now we're here with the permission of Louis and Rita Bedard, so I don't want people to think we're trespassing here.
No, I talked to Mr. Bedard over the weekend, and I got permission from him to do the filming here in the house and in the shed.
Okay, so this tall portion here was the original home that he built.
Yes.
And then this here was added on and became the tavern part.
I've been in the house many times, and the original house here that you see here, which was built 1800, when you look inside, it has very nice French molding. It's a very beautiful house. I mean, big windows, etc. And then a few years after they built this house, they added this addition, and so the addition's a lot more rustic. It's more simple. The molding is simple, and there's rooms upstairs and downstairs, and there are several fireplaces that you can see here, and the fireplaces were used to warm these bed warmers, which were then used to keep people warm at night during the winter.
Yeah. All right, so here's one of those historic markers here behind these flowers. Okay. Lead on, tell us what we're looking at here. Again, we're with David Patrick.
I did two panels over the years, and we'll look at this panel first.
That's all right.
And so this panel here is what I created, 2010 or 11, and it shows a 1948 aerial photograph of the property, showing where the tavern was, and then where the cemetery was to the south, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then there's several pictures. And up on the top are actually the paintings of Elias and Lovisa Dewey with one of their grandchildren. The paintings are now at Clinton County Historical Association in Plattsburgh. When I did my calendar about Dewey's Tavern, 2011, I think it was 2011, I actually found out that the paintings were in Kansas. It was owned by a Plattsburgh person, and I contacted him and asked him if he was willing to send him back to Clinton County, and he agreed. He was from Plattsburgh. He had a big relationship with CCHA, so he worked with them for years. So he sent them back to the museum. And what I found at the same time was he owned the mirror that was broken by a British soldier that was owned by the Deweys. The soldier was looking for a spy in a box, and he ran his sword through the box and broke the mirror. And just last year, the owner of that mirror sent the mirror to CCHA. So that's hanging on the wall. Hopefully we'll see that a little bit later. But what's interesting, if you look at the painting pictures of the shed, and this is before Mr. Bedard put metal siding on one side, is just a decade ago, you could see the actual axe marks of the people who cut the logs in 1797. It's called an adze, A-D-Z-E or something. And you can see how they created the cabin. And I took a lot of photos inside the cabin, and we'll look at that in a few minutes. But those pictures, it's very interesting when you look in there. You can actually see the marks of the axes from over 200 years ago.
Okay, we should point out that these historic markers, I'll call them, are written in French and English.
Yeah, the markers were sponsored by the Lake Champlain Basin Program. That's in partnership with the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership. And there's actually panels all over Clinton County and probably other counties too. I did a number of them. I did these two here. I did one in front of Alan Racine's house on where the British Army, the American Army, was camped in the village of Champlain. I also did the large one at Point-à-Fer, where the little park is, and I did the blue and yellow historic marker for the what's called the quote-unquote White House, which is the house at Point-à-Fer.
Yeah, and Point-à-Fer, we won't elaborate on that, but our local history goes back to the French and Indian War. And
it goes back to 1760, June 1760, when there was the French and Indian War, and Rogers Rangers had a battle literally where the campground is on Route 9B at the Point-à-Fer entrance. So anyway, the two blue and yellow markers that you see here in this on this panel, they were two of six that were dedicated August 1938. Hugh McClellan, who was my relative, he was the one who initiated the markers, and it was a huge celebration. I think it was like the 150th anniversary of Champlain, and so one of them shows the burying yard of Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Forsyth, who was killed just up the road here in Canada. I've actually met one of his descendants a few times, and about a decade ago. And then there's the campground of the British Army, which is literally where Alan Racine's house is, the stone house, which was built 1808.
Now the burying yard, the sign is on Oak Street in Champlain, the village.
Yeah, the burying yard's on Oak Street. And then I created a map which shows all of the major skirmishes that took place in the town of Champlain, and there was a lot of activity. And as you can see, it all centers around Dewey's Tavern. You had places where Benjamin Forsyth was shot, which was right over the border. In retaliation, the British commander was shot literally just up the road here, maybe a mile, in the United States. And there was skirmishes literally in the fields behind us with the riflemen. And then you had encampments 3 or 4 times by different generals of different armies. And then basically they decided to they marched to Plattsburgh, as I said, down Route 276 here, and also down Prospect Street through Main Street. And then there was Murray's Raid, where Murray he burned a lot of stuff in Plattsburgh and in Burlington, and then some of his troops came up the Chazy River to Champlain and burned down the 2 barracks that were built. One was built on Pliny Moore's field where Alan Racine's house was. So that's generally the history. I've written about the history twice. One was I think in 2006, and then one was after that, which was more of a comprehensive history of the War of 1812. Those were in my calendars that I did, and I had a lot of pictures and maps when I did that.
The next building that David's going to tell us about is this little baby here. Looks like it has a fireplace inside, And this red building was not built in the 1800s. I'm reasonably sure of that. But we're here. What are we looking at, David?
So we're looking at the original log cabin built by Elias Dewey. The looks now are deceiving. It doesn't look as old as it really is. Probably around 2010 or 9, Mr. Bedard put this metal siding in front of it. But behind it, I did take pictures of it maybe around 2005 or 6. You could actually see the wood, the original logs
And the axe marks.
and the
so on.
axe marks and the where the joints where the corners meet, and those were quite interesting.
Now, he lived in here with his 4 children for a
so
period of time?
so he came here. All the children, I think, were born. He had 13 kids,
Mhm.
and not everyone. I think maybe 10 of them survived, but 4 of them were actually born in this cabin over three or 4 years, and that's where the family lived. And I know there was a set of twins, so there was probably like 3 births or so during this time, and the family lived here. And literally where we're standing between here and the house is where the potash building was, and so it was close to the house, and you can actually see remnants of it. There's actually stonework poking out of the ground, but that was where the potash building was. This building here was later used by Mr. Bedard as a pigsty, and there's actually a large pot in it. I guess he boiled pigs years ago.
All right.
And we'll look at it, and I think some of the wood has been gnawed by the pigs. But this is, when we look inside here, we're going to see what the settlers lived in, and the simple conditions that they lived under.
Well, obviously, the interior changed after the pigs got in here, but
A lot of things changed. It was made into more like a stable.
but you can see where they all huddled around here. This is quite a fireplace here.
Yeah, this fireplace was added by probably Mr. Bedard or, something after that. But when we look at the mortar between the logs,
Mm-hmm.
that's and the logs themselves, and the stairway is original. The stairway was used. The people lived up in their bedrooms were upstairs in what we call the loft. And of course, the stable here that you're looking at was not there. This was an open area, and this is where the family lived. You can look here. If you look here,
There's some marking in the cement here, and
the
somebody
cement was, of course,
added, yeah.
years later, but you can actually see the wood axe marks from 1797 right here.
People chopping up. Every time I have to deal with an old building, we just took a barn down last year, built in the late 1800s, and the amount of work that went through, cutting everything and moving
And
everything.
Take a look at this, how they joined the rafters to the side of the house here. This was all cut
Yep.
over 200 years ago.
Yep.
But it's amazing that you can see the axe marks right here. And this house, this is pure pioneer, marksmanship here.
Okay, we'll try to back out of here without falling head over heels. Anything in
So
that
even though
direction we need to say?
the
No?
shed looks a little bit, old, it's
Yeah.
still, and still standing, and it's still
Outside of the roof bending a little, I'd say the walls are pretty sturdy.
yeah. This is a very sturdy cabin. This this wood here is probably about a foot thick. I mean, look at the logs here.
Yeah, these logs, I'm just looking at them, got to be 18 inches to 2 feet
Yeah,
in height in that case right there, and some of
Yeah.
these are well over a foot.
yeah,
So this is just the manpower that went into lifting
yeah.
those.
I mean, think of how hard it was to cut this wood to take the bark off, and actually you can still see the bark.
Yeah, there's still bark on
There's
it.
still bark on this wood here. It's just the sides have been planed, and of course at that time there weren't really many sawmills around. Plenty More did have a sawmill he built 1788 that was in Perry's Mills, but obviously Mr. Dewey decided just to build a rough log cabin, and perhaps he got the wood for the main house from Plenty More, from the sawmill. But in those days, people built log cabins
Well, yeah,
and not frame houses.
obviously.
And you can see the stairway. This was the original stairway up to the second floor. The pigs, they gnawed at the bottom of the stair here,
On pigs.
but this was the original stairway up to the second floor, and this is where the children slept.
I got to warn you, David, we're going to show these in the order that I record them. So
Oh, really?
for the people,
You don't,
I'm not going to move them around. Nope, we're going to, it's the order we record them. And as far as the people viewing, just moments ago, we were in Champlain, and then we had a gentleman pull up and chatted with us for about an hour. Very interesting stories he had to tell. And by that time, it was time for me to leave. So we're going to pick up on that story after we leave here in 2 days from now. Today is Wednesday. We started the show on a Monday. Today's the 3rd of August. And we're at the Clinton County Historical Association. So what are we doing here, David?
so here we're going to be looking at the owners of Dewey's Tavern, and the builder of Dewey's Tavern, which is Elias Dewey, and he had a wife named Lovisa Hamilton Dewey, and she was the daughter of John Hamilton, who lived up on the road on Route 276.
A little closer to the border than the
A
Dewey
little bit
Tavern.
close, about halfway to the border.
Yeah.
He owned property there, and so what we have here is we have two paintings of Elias and Lovisa. They were made in around 1834, and Elias is age 66, I think, and she's about 61 years old, and they're shown with one of their grandsons holding an apple.
That's a grandson.
That's a grandson. That's typical of that time period, even though it looks like a dress. That's what young boys were dressed in those days. The paintings were painted by a itinerant folk artist named Ruth W. Shute. What's interesting about the name Shute is that it's a Champlain name. So just down the road in Champlain is the Shute Cemetery, and there was a person named William Shute who lived there.
S-H-U-T-E.
S-H-U-T-E.
Yeah.
So he was actually the brother of her husband, who came. They came from New Hampshire, but in any case, so they were itinerant artists, folk artists out of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and in 1834 they came to Plattsburgh, stayed at the hotel where the Cumberland Hotel used to be on Margaret Street, and she put an advertisement in the Plattsburgh Republican newspaper advertising for people to come to get their portraits painted. And so a lady named Virginia Mason Burdick, a long time ago, she actually wrote an article about these paintings and the artist many, many years ago in the CCHA magazine called The Antiquarian. So that's where some of my information comes from. So she was an artist. She made a lot of paintings, sometimes watercolors. These are oil on canvas, and it shows Elias with a clay pipe, and like I said, he's 66 years old, and Lovisa is 61 years old with a grandson, and this was made in 1834. Now, what's interesting about these two paintings is that they were handed down to one of her children and then grandchildren, and then it eventually went to someone else who was in Plattsburgh, and when that person died, it went to their son, a person who's well known in Plattsburgh area, the name, and at some point he moved to Kansas, and these two paintings went to Kansas. And so when I was working on my 2010 Champlain Historic Calendar, which was done in 2009, I started researching these paintings in Dewey's Tavern because I worked on the War of 1812. And I found that these paintings were, there was an article in the Press Republican about the paintings, and it mentioned the owner of the paintings, and lo and behold, the owner, because he had Plattsburgh ties, was a member of CCHA. And so I contacted him through the mail, and we corresponded through email after, and I said, did you want to send these paintings back to Clinton County? I mentioned Champlain, and I also mentioned the museum here, CCHA. And because he had a strong relationship with CCHA, he was a life member, and had worked with them for years, he decided to donate the two paintings to CCHA. And so we worked, so over time, the paintings came back to Clinton County. And what's interesting was we also found out that he owned the mirror that was broken by a British soldier, which we'll be talking about in a minute. And he had that, and he was interested in donating it, but not at that time. And so some time went, and that occurred, in the year 2021. So that's a history of the two people, Elias and Lovisa Dewey. They were buried in the Dewey family cemetery across the road from their house, which is technically across the road from the school today. And in 1909, their granddaughter moved all of the stones and some of the bodies to Glenwood Cemetery, but the stones for Elias and Lovisa have never been found. We actually think they're probably buried in the field now owned by the town of Champlain, and we also believe that their bodies are there too, because a number of bodies were not moved when the stones were moved. So that's a short history of the paintings and of the Deweys.
We have now moved downstairs at the Clinton County Historical Association Museum, and this is a mirror that only the very tall can see themselves in, David.
Yes, this is the mirror, very, very famous mirror. It was actually chipped by a British soldier. And the story of the mirror is that during the War of 1812, and it probably was in August of 1814, the British were coming into Champlain. They came in numerous times over the past 2 years, and the Deweys were afraid that their house was going to be burnt down or ransacked, and they decided to move to Malone, where they had some property. And this mirror was wrapped in a feather bed because the family grew, they raised geese, and they used the feathers for pillows and mattresses. And so this was wrapped in a feather bed and put in a large crate. And a British soldier saw the crate, and he thought a spy was in the crate, and ran his sword through the crate and broke the mirror. And of course, no spy was there. And the family decided to keep the mirror in the broken condition, because they wanted to remind them of the struggles that they went through during that 2-year period during the war. As I mentioned, in the previously, their house was frequented by the British Army and the American Army, multiple generals of both armies, officers, and it was used as a place to negotiate 2 prisoner of war treaties, and so there was a lot of turmoil during those 2 years. So this mirror symbolized the struggles that the family went through. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the mirror was donated by a former Plattsburgh resident, and in June of 2021, and that was the 3rd item that he had, and it arrived safely, from Kansas, which was amazing because it is a mirror, and it's now on display here at CCHA. And one of the board members used some of my information from my Champlain historic calendar to write a little history of the mirror and the tavern, and showing the original log cabin, which was built around 1797 that we saw previously, and then the main house. So the mirror is a very nice mirror. Has a wooden frame and a very nice picture at the top of of a farm scene with a shed or a house surrounded by trees on a hill. It's a very nice display.
Okay. So,
And
anything else in the mirror?
And so that's really the story of the mirror. The calendar where most of my information is found was the 2010 Champlain Historic Calendar, and where I gave a history of the War of 1812, and in the back was a picture of the mirror that I was able to get a picture of back then, and also had pictures of Dewey's Tavern and the War of 1812 events.
Sorry to interrupt you guys.
So we are back in.
So again, I wrote in the 2010 calendar, which I'm still selling, has a history of Dewey's Tavern and its role in the War of 1812, and it shows the tavern and the farmland from a 1948 photograph, and what the property looked like back in 1948, and it's a long history. It's not just a few pictures in the calendar. It's I think it was a 15-page original essay that I wrote. Lo and behold, there's the pictures of Elias and Lovisa Dewey, and again, more history, and then numerous photographs of the original log cabin, and showing what we saw the other day. Again, here's the axe marks, and here's the joint that's now covered by metal tin sheeting. We'll be talking a little bit later at the Glenwood Cemetery, and these are the Dewey family stones. I think only half the stones actually have burials underneath them, and the rest are in the field owned by the town of Champlain, the park now. And again, here's the picture of the mirror, which I was able to get in 2009 from the owner, and it discusses the history of the mirror and the flight of the family to Malone when they had to flee, and that's when the mirror was broken.
And those are reenactors. That's not a photo of the actual soldiers that.
No photo from 1814. These are reenactors during one of our ceremonies that we had every year. We had it for I think 9 years, and It was the ceremony that opened up the Battle of Plattsburgh events, and because Champlain was the first event in the War of 1812, and it was the first stop of the British on the way to Plattsburgh. So we always had a ceremony about the same day that the British came into Champlain, and then I know Calvin had we had a flag raising at the park, and then we also had a flag lowering on September 25th, which is the last day that the British were in Champlain. So they had to stay in Champlain because the roads were so bad, and they couldn't move the cannon over the roads. So that's why they stayed until the 25th of September. So it was a long 2 years for the Deweys.
Yeah, four full weeks at Dewey Tavern for the
Yes.
British invasion. So I like to say that the battles of Plattsburgh started and ended in Champlain.
Yes, exactly. It did. And there was actually more events that occurred in Champlain, the town of Champlain, than in Plattsburgh. I mean, we'll talk about it in a few days, but you had multiple armies camped in the fields. You had multiple skirmishes with the riflemen. That's when Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Forsyth, he was killed literally right over the border, and another British commander was killed on Route 276. The British burned down two barracks in the village of Champlain. One was on Plentymore's land, across from where Alan Racine's house is, and there was a lot of people coming and going from both sides of the army, and it's very interesting to try to understand all the events that occurred, during the war, because there was just so many different things. The Plentymore house, which is the house of where my ancestor lived, was used as the headquarters of both the British and the American armies. That property is now the Clark Funeral Home. So again, just imagine having 10,000, 14,000 soldiers marching over the bridge on Main Street, up or down Main Street, past the telephone company and down to Plattsburgh.
Yeah.
That was the route, and I think we find it hard to imagine for 12 hours an army marching over that bridge, but they did. That's what's recorded.
And you mentioned the Plentymore House. There it is on the other side of
Plentymore House. This is the Samuel D. Champlain History Center, the First National Bank building. This was an early bridge, and this was called the Plentymore Store. It was a Plentymore Junior store, and that was at the corner of River Street and Elm and Oak Street.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had half the British Army marching over the whatever bridge that was here in 1814.
Yeah, the Plentymore House was there, but these other buildings were not.
None of the buildings here were here.
And then back is the Champlain Academy, which was
Champlain
the high school
Academy
that burned
was
around
there.
1939.
The
or so.
Savoy was a little bit over here,
Mhm.
that some people might remember.
But the Knights of Columbus right now are on where your thumb is. And
Knights of Columbus building was actually owned by my relatives for 100 years, 1840s to the 1950s. And that was actually the Presbyterian Session House. And that's this long building here. And today it's the Knights of Columbus building.
Right, and into the 1960s, Woody McClellan was still running a print shop downstairs at that building.
The Morsel Press was down in the basement up until about 1982, and when he died. And now the whole building's owned by the Knights of Columbus.
Okay. We're going to wrap that up, and we're going to wrap it up with this camera looking at itself here in the mirror. And looking at David too. Through the magic of television, we are back. We left the Clinton County Historical Association, and David Patrick and I are back here at the corner of Prospect Street and Route 276, and we're in front of Dewey Tavern. What's on your mind today, Dave?
Today I just like to spend just a few minutes talking about the events during the War of 1812 and the events that specifically happened here at this house. So we are in front of the Dewey's Tavern, and which was a major stopping point for both the American and British armies. And so I just want to give everyone a list of the things that happened during the at this house here. So starting November of 1812, General Henry Dearborn's army of 5,000 soldiers. He was an American Army general. He camped in the fields where Alan Racine's house is today, in the village of Champlain, and he used the house of the Pliny Moore as his headquarters. Pliny Moore's house is where the Clark Funeral Home is today. So after he camped in the fields, he literally walked up came down Prospect Street, made a turn here, and walked up to Canada, and he went to Lacole, where he was easily defeated, and then he marched out of Champlain. The next big event was September of 1813, when General Wade Hampton's army camped in these fields, and the general did stay at this house here at Dewey's Tavern, and he obviously went through this front door here, and so he was camped here for a day or two, and then he went to Odelltown, just over the border, and Odelltown.
Odelltown, yeah.
And it was named after the Odells, Odell. A lot of them in town, and some of them married into the Dewey family. But he went up there and again was easily defeated by the British.
Yeah, well, we have a nice program that were done years ago, well over 25 years ago, with Jean Lebrun, who was a historian on the other side of the border, and he gave us that story that took place in the Battle of Odelltown in that little church there, surrounding that little church.
The stone church, I guess.
Yeah.
And then fast forward a year to March of 1814. This is 6 months before the Battle of Plattsburgh. General James Wilkinson's army camped in these fields here. He went up to Lacole, and there was the Battle of the Stone Mill, and it was a fierce battle. People were firing from both sides, and I think the Americans were firing on their own men at some point. And 120 soldiers were killed or wounded. All of these soldiers were brought back to Dewey's Tavern, and they were placed in the tavern in the back, in the shed, in the potash house, any other farms that were there. Drusilla Dewey was a young child, but she remembers the soldiers were laid out everywhere in this house and in the back shed that we saw the other day. And when they died, the soldiers were buried in the Dewey family cemetery, which we'll show in a few minutes. This was a 1-acre cemetery across the road here, where the town of Champlain owns now.
When we say across the road, we mean across this road,
Prospect.
this road here, and where we see the flagpole across from northeastern Clinton.
Yeah. And so that was in March of 1814. There was also a lot of skirmishes that occurred literally up and down this road here, Route 276, and in the fields between Prospect Street and the Canadian border. That's where the Benjamin Forsyth's riflemen were engaging the British militia, and there was a number of ambushes and fights all over this land here, just north of Champlain. And what happened was, in June of 1814, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Forsyth was killed literally right over the border when he stepped on a log and got shot in the chest. And he was brought back where he died, and his funeral was at the Pliny Moore house, which is my ancestor's house, which was again the property where the Clark Funeral Home is. He was then buried in the old burying yard, which was up on Oak Street, and he was in an unmarked grave. Later on, in the 1870s, the cemetery was dug up and moved to Glenwood, but his grave was never found because it was unmarked. And in 2013, I worked with some archaeologists at Plattsburgh State, Chris Wolf and Andrew Black, and we were looking for that burial, but we didn't find it. It was where the house of John Rowe stood at the time, and a second house too. So after he was killed, Forsyth was killed, and I should say I've actually met one of the ancestors of Forsyth. I had
Descendant
of Forsyth. About 10 years ago, met her in Burlington, and she was very eager trying to find her ancestor's grave. And so he was actually from North Carolina. And I should also say that there's a county in North Carolina named after Forsyth, who was buried here in Champlain. So after he was killed in Champlain, in retaliation, the American riflemen killed Captain Mayhew, who was a Canadian. They ambushed him literally right up the road here on the American side, and he was brought to the Pliny Moore house to be cared for, and they brought doctors down from Canada, and on his deathbed he said that the British Army was going to invade in a few weeks, and to basically to try to escape Champlain because they were coming in a few weeks. So that was in June and August of 1814. So starting on August 27th, General Izard, who was an American general, he was camped in right over St. Mary's Church on the hill where Pine Street is. He had another 5,000 man army, and he was ordered to leave. The next day, August 28th, a British Indian force came into Champlain to check on the situation, and then literally the day after that, the British started marching down this road here, Route 276. The army camped here in these fields here, at where the school was, across this area here, and then the second half of the army camped where Alan Racine's house is today, in the fields there, and they used Alan Racine's house as a commissary, and so British soldiers were camped in the house. That house was built by Pliny Moore in 1808.
And who lived there at that point?
Basically, Pliny Moore had renters there, farmers, people who farmed the land. He owned the property, but it was different farmers. It was in the Pliny Moore family, and then it went into the Nye family, which I'm related to, up until the early 1900s, the stone house. And then people died, and then it went to different people after. So on September 1st, the left wing of the British Army marched down Route 276 and camped here in the fields around Dewey's. And on September 4th, Pliny Moore wrote, British Army, about 14,000 strong, passed on to Chazy with 16 pieces of cannon. That's a first-hand account of the British Army passing through Champlain. And it's interesting to note that it took 12 hours for the British Army to march over the bridge on where the Main Street is, and on their way to Chazy. So then September 11th was the Battle of Plattsburgh, and the British lost. You could actually hear the cannons firing in Plattsburgh from Dewey's Tavern, from Champlain. The people at Dewey's could hear the cannons. And so when the British came the next day, they left their wounded, the dead and wounded here at Dewey's Tavern, and the dead were buried in the Dewey family cemetery. And so most of the British Army went up to Canada, but it wasn't until September 25th that the last of the British Army left Champlain, and they were delayed because they had the cannons and the roads were basically impassable. So it took 2 weeks for the roads to get good. And that's when the war was finally over in Champlain. I think it was February is when the treaty was signed, 1815, between the Americans and the British. So as we mentioned at the CCHA, the mirror that was broken by the British soldier was never repaired because the family always viewed that as a reminder of what they went through during the war. And fortunately, the mirror has survived over 200 years. And so that's the history of Champlain. A lot of the information I received, or that I have, including like plenty more information and a lot of the information I use for the talking about the war and Dewey's, came from papers and collections found at special collections at Plattsburgh State Feinberg Library. They have a huge collection of material. Part of that collection was the McClellan collection that my relative Hugh McClellan had collected, and that material is found at special collections. Also, there's CCHA has a lot of material and books and references, and the Champlain History Center here in Champlain also has many books and histories about the War of 1812, including Alan Everest's book on the War of 1812, which I got a lot of information from and trying to prepare these type of talks. So that information's divided between 3 different institutions, as well as found in the newspaper clippings that are found online at the newspaper historic newspaper website. And so I just want to let people know that this information is out there, and it's found locally here in these 3 different institutions.
Okay. Alrighty. Again, that's Rouse's Point's in that direction. The village of Champlain is behind us to the west. Just as a passing point of interest, this is where the well was located, just behind the tavern here, behind the home. Every building, every house during this era had a well. That's where this one was located. This, obviously, the covering is not from 1800s, but the well is, and it's obviously with some cement around there. They've done some work since originally dug many years ago. And just to get another view here, looking at it from the Rouse's Point side, we'll say, the east side is the original structure. We looked at this portion here when we were beginning this program. So this was added on in the years after the original construction of the front of the building. And as we're doing this, we have to mention that there is a for sale sign out front. So we hope the future owners from this date here in 2022 will appreciate and preserve the history of this historic dwelling here in the town of Champlain. We have moved now. We are across 276 on the eastern side of the road, in an area known as Bob Venn Park, which was purchased from the Louis and Rita Bedard and now owned by the town of Champlain. This flagpole here, donated by the Woodmen of the World. Excuse me, Woodmen of the World. Makes it easy to find. What do you have to say about this area here, Dave?
So what we're standing now in is the south field of the Dewey's Tavern. Elias Dewey purchased 500 acres of land, which was divided by Prospect Street and Route 276. So his land was north and south of Prospect. It was across the street where the school is today, and so on his land he established a 1-acre cemetery. Unfortunately, their first daughter, she was about 20 years old, died around 1811, and she was the first burial here in the cemetery. And later on, a few other children died, and then we have soldiers buried here. And so, as I mentioned, we have American and British soldiers buried here in this property. The question is, where exactly is the cemetery? This is a large field, I think, 12 acres or so?
I think it comes out to
And
13, yeah.
13. And Mr. Bedard sold that, or gave that to the town some years ago for the Bob Van Park. And then the woodmen established the flagpole here. The question was, where is the cemetery? So what happened to the cemetery was, in the early 1900s, the Dewey family had, the grandchildren were alive, etc., of the first Deweys, and they had all moved away. Some were in Malone. A lady named Elizabeth Barber married a banker in Plattsburgh, so they had no ties to this property, and they sold that to Frank Castine, and then later,
Let's
after
pronounce it Castine.
Castine, and then it went to his nephew Peter, etc., and then Peter then sold the property to George Bedard, Louis Bedard's father, and then George Bedard gave it to Louis Bedard around 1960. So he purchased the property, George Bedard, 1950, from Peter. So at that time, in 1909, the property had left the Dewey family, and Elizabeth Barber decided to take all of the stones that she could see, all the cemetery stones, and move them to Glenwood Cemetery, and she bought a plot. This is 1909. So all of the stones were moved to Glenwood, and then there's 2 nice rows, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And from what I suspected, based on the location and how the stones were, I suspected that only half the bodies were moved, and the other half were left here in the cemetery, in this field here. Meaning that's because some of the bodies that were moved was her uncle, etc., and aunt. They died only 10 or 20 years before, and whereas other people had died 100 years before. So it would have been a lot easier to remove a coffin that was only 10 years old than any remains that were 100 years old. So anyway, all of the stones were removed to Glenwood, and that was the last, and this field became opened, for plowing, etc. So the only thing that remained for many, many years was the cemetery gate. The cemetery gate is where people are driving off Route 276 now. The gate is long gone, but where the cars pull off Route 276 into this field, where there's a culvert there, that's where the gate was. So now the question is, where do people walk to get to the cemetery? It was moved in 1909, so even Louis Bedard's father never saw the cemetery, and Louis never saw the cemetery either. So we think, based on the lay of the land and the fact that certain areas of this field gets flooded, we're in the high sandy section here. We think the cemetery was in this location near where the flagpole is. So in 2013, I partnered with the Plattsburgh State Archaeology Department, Andrew Black and Chris Wolf, and we actually hired someone with a ground penetrating radar, and we mapped out 2 plots in this field here. One was 60 meters by 100 meters, Then there was another smaller one around the flagpole that was like 20 or 30 square meters. And we did a big grid. The resolution wasn't that great because we were doing such a large area. And they analyzed the map and decided on a couple spots to dig. And then some month or so later, they had a number of students come and do archaeologic digs, looking for any remains of bones, etc. And I know Calvin's videotaped that. That's on the Hometown Cable YouTube channel, and so that's all there. But anyway, we saw a lot of interesting signals, but we only looked at 2 sites, excavation wise. We didn't find anything, so the remains of the cemetery still remains to be found.
The exact location, yes.
The exact location.
Right.
Analyzing the data and talking to people, etc., I still believe that the cemetery is in the area of this flagpole, maybe a little bit south of the flagpole. It may be where we're literally standing right now, which was on the edge of the field, which would have been a good spot to put a cemetery if it's on the edge of the property.
Right. Farmers didn't want to have to work around a cemetery to get their crops in.
Yeah, so typically the cemetery would not be in the low area where the railroad tracks are, and it would not be in the part of on the field looking where you're looking now to the east, where it's low and rocky. There's ledge that comes up to the surface, so they wouldn't have been there either. So I think we're in the right spot, and there's definitely people buried here, and I guarantee you that there's American soldiers buried under our feet someplace.
And some British ones too.
And British too, based on the legends of what people said, that the British soldiers were buried here, taken care of and buried here after the war of Battle of Plattsburgh. But we definitely know there was 120 killed and wounded. We don't know how many of those 120 were actually died, but probably the number was quite high. So we can definitely say that there's a lot of American soldiers buried here, probably right where we're looking right now, probably under our feet.
Yeah, very likely. That tree line we're looking at here is where the Northern Railroad came through in 1850, which was well after the 1814 Battle of Plattsburgh. So that tree line did not exist back in 1814. The property line was probably somewhere between that porta potty and this pole here somewhere. So that little triangle in that direction there was part of their property. That's on the other side, now owned by the Robinson family. On the other side of the 1850 railroad tracks that were abandoned in early 1960s. And the paved area we're looking at here is the Harry J. McManus all-purpose, all-terrain, all-purpose track here that gets Champlain, the village of Champlain, and ties in with the village of Rouse's Point. It runs through the township here. Okay, we're moving to the cemetery.
Yeah, we'll go to the Glenwood Cemetery now and look at the cemetery stones that were in this field. It goes from that.
Okay, we are at the Glenwood Cemetery off Oak Street in Champlain, and we've heard several times David mention these headstones that were brought here. Some have a Hamilton name on them, some have the Dewey name, and some might even have some other names on them. So tell us about these stones here.
So anyway, as I said earlier, the Dewey family was buried in the 1 acre plot on their family cemetery south of their house. It wasn't just the Deweys that were that died and were buried on the cemetery. There were many other families, some that were related to the Deweys, as well as through marriage, and then friends, etc. So we have 2 rows of headstones here, and a second row in the back. The row in the back is a lot of the people are Lovisa's, Hamilton, Lovisa Dewey. She was originally a Hamilton. Her family is buried on the in the second row, and a lot of the Deweys are buried here in the first row. And we'll just go over a couple of the names.
No, we're
here.
saying buried, but as you can see from that back row in particular, the stones are very close. So whether
Yeah.
they're actually buried there or the stones were just moved here is conjecture.
So that was my question that I had for a number of years, is who's buried here, and are the stones just there? So you can see in this first row here, the stones are far apart, and they're in their own bases. Whereas the second row in the back, everyone's been buried. All the stones are in the same cement. Now, most of those people that are in the back died long time before 1909. So I see died 1832, 1833, 1861, etc. Whereas I know some of these people here in the first row died 1875, 1885, etc. So in 1909, their coffins were still intact. The people in the back, there probably wouldn't have been a lot that remained. So before we mapped out the cemetery at Dewey's Tavern, we had a person with the ground penetrating radar. He ran couple scans over each row here and in the row in the back. And for the first row here, where the large cemetery stones are, we got very strong signals, meaning that there were definitely coffins in the ground here, and so the people were probably moved from the cemetery in the field. The second row in the back, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people at least, we got virtually no signal. So it was a flat line, and that indicated that there was probably no burials at that spot, and that the people that are shown here on the stones are still probably buried in the field that we were in, owned by the town of Champlain. As I stated a while back, the Dewey family was very large. The Deweys had 12 children, and Elias and Lovisa. Elias was born 1767 and died, in his 70s. And Lovisa was born 1773, and they had a number of children. A few younger children, their stones are not present here, and they were probably in the field. Two stones that are definitely missing, which I'm sure there were stones that existed, are Elias and Lovisa, the parents, the first Deweys. Those stones are not here, and we believe that they're still in the field, probably buried, not too far down, but they're probably still there, probably large stones. And what's interesting is, a lot of their children are buried here. Drusilla, who I mentioned, was one of the last family members to live, and she's actually buried, and her stone is one of these larger stones here. She's the one that witnessed the troops at the cabin, at the house, and which I mentioned earlier. If we can walk around over here.
Okay. Well, we have found Drusilla.
So these are the stones looking from the other side. A couple interesting ones. Silas H. Dewey was the last Dewey son to live at the Dewey's Tavern. He died 1884. His granddaughter was Elizabeth Barber, who moved the cemetery stones from the family cemetery to Glenwood here. So he died 1884. His sister was Drusilla. She was a twin, And it says here, daughter of Elias and Lovisa Dewey. She died 1879, age 78 years old. Now what's interesting is right next to them is another stone. This was the Newell family, Newell. Not immediately related to the Deweys, but they lived around the corner on Hayford Road, just off Prospect Street. And this is Reverend Samuel Newell. He was a deacon in the Presbyterian Church. He died, I think it says here, December 16th, 1812. What's interesting about that is he was a townsperson who took care of American soldiers who were sick with typhus, which was called camp fever. When Henry Dearborn's army was camped here in Allen Racine's fields in November 1812, a lot of his army was suffering from typhus, which is not typhoid, it's typhus, which is it's spread by fleas from infected, rats and stuff. It was often accompanied armies in those days, and the flea would bite someone, and then the person would, it would go from person to person, and the person would get feverish and most often died. So he was caring for a person who's buried on the other side of the cemetery, American soldier named Caldwell, Richard Caldwell. And he has two stones on the other side of the cemetery. Caldwell was delirious, saw his troops march into Canada, wanted to go, but he couldn't. And he ended up dying. Unfortunately, 2 weeks later, Samuel died on December 16th, and 1812. So he died caring for Richard Caldwell. 2 weeks after that, his daughter died on Christmas Day of typhus too. So he must have been bitten and got infected with typhus. He was at his house and he gave it to his daughter. His daughter died 2 weeks later, December 25th, 1812. And so those are the two top names on the stone. Then there's a third person died 1832.
Probably a son, age 23.
Yeah.
But this would indicate to me that where the stone originally sat, there were three bodies there.
Yeah, there's three bodies, and it doesn't look like there's three bodies, space for three here. So we don't know, again, who was moved and who wasn't, especially if someone died in 1832 and two people died 1812.
Right.
It's chances are that these people here are still in the field that we were at, the Dewey Cemetery. But it's interesting to note that these people were more or less casualties of the War of 1812 in an indirect way.
Yeah.
And the person that infected them is buried in another part. He was originally buried in the old burying yard on Oak Street, and he was given a small gravestone, and Pliny Moore knew where the stone was because he saw him buried, and the soldier's wife contacted Pliny Moore and asked about her husband. He goes, "Oh yeah, I know where his stone is because I saw where he was buried, and I think Pliny Moore gave him a small stone." And then the family years later spent some money and got a large stone made for Caldwell, and that's in the cemetery on the other side. So he has two stones, and both were, originally down the road where the John Rowe house stood.
Now another interesting thing is that these three stones here are facing this direction, and the others over here are facing the other direction. Usually the writing is facing where the people are buried, and so you wonder what.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened.
Yeah.
Maybe it's divided by people, families.
I don't know.
Over on this side here, this is where all of the stones are buried or set in the same concrete, and we had no signal here with the ground penetrating radar to indicate that there's people here, so these are just the stones, most likely. And you can see some of these people here in memory of Sarah Hamilton. Her husband was John Hamilton, and she died 1833, aged 82 years old, 82 in 1833, and her father, John, looks like could be 1814, 68. He was age 68, so that could have been, well, that was December 1814, so he died just a couple months after the war here in Champlain ended. And then his family's over here too, other Hamiltons. But these people are all buried in the field at Dewey's Tavern, which is owned by the town of Champlain now.
And it's interesting too, so how many of them made it into their 70s and 80s. All those diseases going around didn't get them. They lived a long life.
There's a lot of people, children, even the Deweys. You know, you had children die as babies, as teenagers, and into their 20s. But once you made it past your 20s, you were probably going to live to a very old age. Sarah Hamilton lived to age 82 in 1833. But unfortunately over here, Elias, the son of Elias and Hamilton, Elias was probably the son of John, and he died at age 20.
Right.
So anyway, the Hamiltons lived just up the road from the Deweys on Route 276. Their house is not present today, but their son's house is across the street, which is present, is still standing today. So that's an overview of the Dewey family, the history of the War of 1812, which is intertwined with the Dewey family. As I said, my 2010 calendar had the whole history of Dewey's Tavern and the War of 1812, and I do still sell these. And a lot of the material that I got for this calendar and the information I mentioned today is found at special collections at the Feinberg Library in Plattsburgh, Clinton County Historical Association, and Champlain History Center here in Champlain by the bridge. There's a lot of material, some of it primary sources of information, and other times it's books and newspaper clippings. The newspaper clippings were very good at, there was a lot of articles on Dewey's Tavern. And so there's a lot of material out there, and I've been trying to connect this information and make it known to people.
All right. So we appreciate you spending part of 3 days with us, David, to get this story out. This is a beautiful cemetery up here in Champlain, a very peaceful place. It's well off the highway, and we were fortunate to take a tour of these grounds a couple decades ago with the then caretaker Marshall Maynard, and it's a very interesting place. And as with any old cemetery, there's a whole lot of history to be learned. And I can't, the McClellans did a great service when they went around and did the cemeteries. And a decade or so ago, my friend Clyde Lewis Sr. also went out and updated a lot of that history of the cemeteries, and you have to appreciate the work that would go into cataloging all these gravestones.
Yeah, the McClellans actually cataloged, it was starting with Hugh McClellan and then later Woody. They cataloged 8,300 cemetery stones in cemeteries in a 100-mile radius of Champlain. And that material is found at special collections and Feinberg Library, all of the original cemetery records, and a few other institutions I think have copies of select cemeteries. But 8,300 stones up until the 1960s. And keep in mind, a lot of those stones are not very readable today.
Yeah, as we just saw.
But they were readable in say 1915 when Hugh started his transcription. He never transcribed Dewey's because that was moved in 1909. So he never saw Dewey's cemetery, even though he was in Champlain, but he never started the project.
Right. Okay, thank you. It's David Patrick and the story of the Dewey Tavern and the surrounding history of that area. Thanks.